What's good? It's Woog. So how do you go from 90s alternative rock and Britpop frontman to extending your career an extra 20 plus years beyond that band's heyday? Well, just ask Damon Albarn, who was in the 90s known for being the frontman of the popular British band BLUR. Just look at BLUR as being kind of a shoegazy rock pop band who was always a bit eccentric, like their style of songwriting was what was considered postmodern, but it was this 90s band that you could kind of look at as being the other side of the coin to the ultra popular 90s British band Oasis. And as we are on the eve of this new Gorillaz album release, Cracker Islan, I want to talk just a little bit about how genius it was for Damon Albarn to be able to pivot from his band BLUR, who again had a lot of success in the 90s, to then teaming up with a comic artist, Jamie Hewlett, in creating a virtual band known as Gorillaz. So it's no secret that in the entertainment industry, you're kind of limited in terms of pop culture shelf life as you age. Now, there are exceptions. Some artists are able to pretty much age gracefully and be able to extend their pop culture relevance as they get older. But those are the exceptions, not the rule. Usually, you're on the clock, and as you get into your 40s and 50s, your days are numbered, if you are even lucky to make it that far in terms of musical relevancy. So how brilliant is the idea to kind of be able to skirt around that and to also take the pressure off of being in front of the camera as the creator, not only project after project, because again, Jamie Hewlett's illustrations would portray the four virtual band members. Those band members are Murdoch Nichols, 2D, Noodle, and Russell Hobbs, each being a different instrumentalist or vocalist in that band Gorillaz. But also when they would embark on tours, they would have a touring band, which would slightly change over the years. But that touring band would often have just the silhouettes exposed of the touring band members, and it would usually be obscured. And then on the big screen, you've got Jamie Hewlett's animation basically acting out the tour activities and the different adventures of these virtual band members. So before this, the band BLUR, they debuted in 1991 with their album Leisure, and then they really started to pick up. Leisure was a bit more shoegazy, but their second and third albums would kind of take shape as a different postmodern like sound. And that was Modern Life is Rubbish in 93, and then Park Life, especially in 1994. That might be BLUR's most acclaimed and celebrated album, although many people like The Great Escape from 1995 and even the self-titled BLUR from 97. So they had these few pretty damn successful, especially in the UK, successful albums through the 90s, and then towards the end of the 90s, Damon Albarn, again the frontman of BLUR, would team up with Jamie Hewlett, where Damon Albarn is creating the music, Jamie Hewlett is creating the visuals, and they are creating not only this virtual band, but virtual universes, a virtual world essentially. And one of the reasons Damon Albarn did this is because he wanted to explore all of the sounds that were in his mind and that he was being influenced by. Because again, this was an alternative rock band in BLUR, but Damon Albarn had taken extreme interest in hip hop, in trip hop, in dub, in Latin and punk music, and different world musics as they called them then. This Gorillaz project gave Damon Albarn an opportunity to explore all of that, and boy did he. So in the late 90s, they started working on the Gorillaz projects, and they eventually debuted with the 2001 Gorillaz album. That's the one with the lead single Clint Eastwood featuring none other than Del the Funky Homosapien from the Bay Area hip hop group Hieroglyphics. A little personal anecdote on this one. When I was in a hip hop group in the early 2000s, we had a show opening up for Hieroglyphics at Qtopia. Qtopia was the place that was hosting a new it wasn't a festival yet, but this was Rock the Bells. This was the early Rock the Bells show. So we opened for Hieroglyphics, and in the green room, we get flagged over to the corner by none other than Del the Funky Homosapien, and he had a little piece in his hand, and he basically offered to smoke us out, and we just looked at each other like, is this really happening? And yes, later on that night when Hyro finally took the stage, Del the Funky Homosapien did perform his verses, his featured verses on the Gorillaz song. Clint Eastwood. That's the I ain't happy, I'm feeling glad I got sunshine. And then Del comes in, finally, someone let me out of my cage. And he just did his whole eccentric verse. Very different dude. But this Gorillaz debut set it off for that virtual band, and then they followed it up a few years later with Demon Days. Now, the first Gorillaz album was produced by the famed underground hip-hop producer Dan the Automator. Dan the Automator teamed up with Del on the Deltron 3030 album. They were collectively, the two of them were known as Deltron 3030. So they did the Deltron album, and it was actually Dan the Automator who Damon Albarn basically hired or teamed up with, I should say, to produce that Gorillaz album. Dan the Automator introduced Damon Albarn to Del the Funky Homosapien. So Damon Albarn and Jamie Hewlett would go from that debut Gorillaz album to Demon Days. Demon Days was produced by Danger Mouse. So they go from a Dan the Automator, which has more like scratch leanings, because they also teamed up with Kid Koala on that debut Gorillaz project. Kid Koala provided a bunch of the turntable scratches for that album. So they went from working with Dan the Automator on the debut to working with Danger Mouse on the follow-up Demon Days. And this is before Danger Mouse was a multi-Grammy award-winning producer. He was pretty much fresh off of early stuff working with Black Keys, and obviously the Grey album, where he basically married a lot of the Jay-Z's lyrics from the Black album, teamed it up with the sounds of the Beatles' White album to make the Grey album. That was kind of the project that set Danger Mouse off. So he produces Demon Days, and whereas Gorillaz was very, in terms of features, they didn't have as many features as some of the albums that would follow, but Del the Funky Homosapien would feature on multiple tracks on Gorillaz. On Demon Days, they had a key contribution from the famed and iconic hip-hop group De La Soul. Rest in peace to Trugoy, Plug 2, just passed away a few weeks ago. But on Demon Days, that featured probably the biggest, or at least most known, well, it's also the commercially the biggest Gorillaz song, and that was Feel Good Inc. That was that do-do, chugga chugga, chugga chugga, do-do. Such a good song. This just had all the right pop leanings, and it's weird because Gorillaz, a little bit like Blur, but even more multi-genre. They dabble in hip-hop, they dabble in indie, they dabble in post-punk, they dabble in a bunch of eclectic genres. It's a very interesting sound, and the guests that Damon Albarn works with on these projects, they just bring those sounds and those genres to life that much more. So Demon Days has some features from MF Doom on a song, along with Bootie Brown, formerly from the Far Side. Bootie Brown has a featured verse on the next most popular song, I would say, on that Demon Days album called Dirty Harry. You'll remember it if you heard it. That instrumental is so sick. Listen to Dirty Harry. It comes on right before Feel Good Inc. on that album. And that song, Dirty Harry, features Bootie Brown. Ike Turner makes an appearance on the album. Roots Manuva, the 60s icon Dennis Hopper has a spoken piece on one of the songs. They work with the London Community Gospel Choir on tracks 14 and 15. It's got another popular song, Dare. So Demon Days is a lot of people's favorite Gorillaz album, and it's their most commercially successful album. They were just clicking on all cylinders. And when these virtual bands, again, with the obscured band members that would be on stage and you could just see a silhouette of the people playing the instruments, whereas like the big screen has all of Jamie Hewlett's illustrations, these were extremely expensive tours to make, and a lot of their like music video work that would accompany the songs on some of these album and song rollouts, very expensive, very involved, but they were just committed to this project over the years. So Demon Days is the biggest Gorillaz album, but my favorite and a lot of people's favorite Gorillaz album would be their next album, Plastic Beach. That dropped in 2010. So the first Gorillaz album, 2001, the second one, 2005, the third one, 2010. So you could tell each one of these undertakings is pretty arduous. And sometimes sprinkled between these albums, Damon Albarn would go back and do a tour or something with his band BLUR. But Plastic Beach, it features the song Stylo with the late Bobby Womack and a featured verse from Mos Def. That's probably the most popular song from that album, although Rhinestone Eyes is sick. Super Fast Jellyfish, again, teaming up with De La Soul. That's a really cool song from the album. My favorite song from that album is Melancholy Hill. Just listen to that synth pop instrumental that leads into the song. It's almost like vintage or peak M83 or MGMT. It's just one of those beautiful instrumentals that was just that synth pop wave around that time, 2010 we're talking. Melancholy Hill. And on this Plastic Beach album, yes, they did lean more into that synth pop vibe. This is probably the poppiest Gorillaz album that they've done, even though you could argue that one of their last two albums, well, either Humanz or maybe Song Machine would be their poppiest album, but I would say maybe Plastic Beach. Again, my favorite Gorillaz album. And this is the first Gorillaz album that was produced by Damon Albarn. Again, he went from Dan the Automator to Danger Mouse. Now he's doing the production himself on the third album, and they have a lot of cool features aside from the ones that I mentioned. They've got Mark E. Smith from the indie band and the shoegaze, dream pop, all kinds of indie from the 80s. The band The Fall, Mark E. Smith, he's featured on this album. Lou Reed, the late icon from the Velvet Underground, featured on this Gorillaz album, and Snoop Dogg and others. Like, pretty multifaceted cast here. And around the time of this Plastic Beach and the subsequent tour, there was a fallout between Damon Albarn and Damon Hewlett because he felt that his features, or should I say his visuals, were being less and less needed and less showcased. So by the time they're touring Plastic Beach, they have the actual touring band members on the stage and visible to the crowd, whereas those renderings of the fictitious characters, 2D, Noodle, Murdoch, Nichols, and such, they are less and less prominent on the stage. And I think that the touring members were actually visible around the time that Gorillaz headlined Coachella, around the time of the Plastic Beach. So while they were touring Plastic Beach, Damon Albarn wrote another album called The Fall. This I don't even really consider to be a full Gorillaz album. Even though it is listed in their discography, this one was basically all done and recorded while on tour. He wanted to basically finish it while on tour so nobody got it twisted, thinking that he brought these songs from tour to the studio and then fixed them up there. No, he basically wanted to make this one as raw and as spontaneous as possible. And this album dropped basically within a year of Plastic Beach. So this one, a lot of people didn't even realize that it was made. But yeah, there is a Gorillaz album right after Plastic Beach called The Fall. Again, this was basically just Damon Albarn trying to make songs on tour. And then it would be another 6 years before they would drop their next album, Humanz. By this time, they've got like Vince Staples rapping on the opening song. And the cast of characters, the featured guests, are a lot more reflective in the artists that were hot around 2017. Although they did once again work with De La Soul, as they so often did. But they have like Kalela on this one. They have Pusha T. And then they also have some OGs like Mavis Staples and Grace Jones. Again, just super multifaceted, multi-genre. They've got Little Sims, they've got Kali Uchis, they've got Jenny Beth from the band Savages, they've got Danny Brown. And this album, Humanz 2017, was produced by the Twilight Tone. He had worked with Kanye West, a bunch of others, like high profile producer, the Twilight Tone. So the last one, Plastic Beach, Damon Albarn produced himself. This one, the Twilight Tone. And I have to say, this album is kind of growing on me. I didn't love it when it first came out. I thought that it was a little too electronic and too modern pop, like in terms of the rap and hip hop that was being made around that time, but it was also kind of art pop-ish. It just seemed like it was a little bit more middle of the road compared to Demon Days and the prior albums. But again, Humanz has kind of grown on me, and it's a concept album. The idea going into this one was basically imagining that Trump wins the election. So again, this was released in the beginning or near the beginning of 2017. When they were making these songs, Trump was running for office, but they were saying, just imagine that he just won the election and what you would feel like the next day. And then that's what went into the concept of making the Humanz album. Whereas the album prior, Plastic Beach, it was basically a fictitious island that was all made from human pollution. So that one's an environmental, climate-based album, where it's an album that's all human waste, debris, Human Pollution, and that is basically the what composes the island. That's Plastic Beach. So yeah, can you tell that I'm pretty fired up about this Gorillaz album? This has just been a remarkable journey, and it has managed to stay interesting throughout the years. I mean, you could argue that the last two albums, the Now and then Song Machine Volume 1, these basically were as good as the albums prior. And also tucked in between some of these Gorillaz releases, there was another BLUR album in 2015 called The Magic Whip. And then there was a Damon Albarn solo album in 2014 called Everyday Robots. So in that long Gorillaz hiatus between Plastic Beach and Humanz, again, Damon Albarn did the solo album in 2014 and did another BLUR album in 2015. And the album that dropped after 2017's Humanz came out just 1 year after. That was the Now, and he wanted to make that one like he made The Fall, basically on tour, just as raw as possible, very few featured guests, and just basically him playing and singing. So the Now is a lot more raw than the albums that have the fully produced sound and fully fleshed out sound with a bunch of guests and so forth. The Now, again, it's a lot more like The Fall, whereas the album after that, which is their most recent album before this new album, Cracker Islan, Song Machine Season 1 came out in 2020, and that is basically Gorillaz in all their glory. Like this is probably my favorite Gorillaz album since Plastic Beach. I thought that it was very good. It made my top 40 albums of 2020 list. Go listen to Song Machine Season 1. I mean, they surprised me. They basically recaptured whatever people thought that they might have lost in their last couple albums. To me, Song Machine is as interesting as anything that they've got, and some of the features are just incredible. Listen to certain songs like The Lost Chord with Lee John or The Pink Phantom with Elton John and Black. That tells you how eclectic this cast of featured guest is. I mean, Robert Smith, the frontman from The Cure, is on the album's intro, Strange Times. My favorite song on the album might be Désolé, featuring Fatoumata Diawara, a female vocalist from Mali. Beautiful song, Désolé. Give that one a listen. But yeah, I really like that Song Machine album. And so now we're gonna embark upon this new release, Cracker Islan, and we'll see if this one stands up with the rest of the super creative Gorillaz discography. Again, not enough can be stated about how creative an endeavor this has been over the years. And by the way, Jamie Hewlett and Damon Albarn did reconcile to make Humanz and the albums that followed after their fallout around the time of Plastic Beach. So yeah, get into the Gorillaz if you haven't. Most people have listened to at least different parts of the Gorillaz discography. Again, their hottest little era was probably between Demon Days and Plastic Beach, although their debut really shot them off. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about how amazingly brilliant it was for Damon Albarn to basically give his career this 20+ year lifeline with this Gorillaz project, which it was just an idea that he wanted to flesh out when they first started, but then he wanted to make a follow-up album to their debut to prove that it wasn't a gimmick, because his idea was, if I do it once and it works, it can still be seen as a gimmick. If we follow it up and have continued success, no one can say it's a gimmick anymore. And he has proven anybody who had doubts on this project wrong. And he was basically making this Gorillaz project out of the frustration watching MTV with Jamie Hewlett one day, just thinking about how ridiculous the state of music was. And this was like in the beginning of the boy band era towards the end of the 90s. And he was basically saying, let's just make this fictitious band. We could do anything we want with these virtual characters. And then they just leaned into the idea. They've made a novel, like a book. They've made, you know, like short movies with these band members and their different adventures. And the book that they made out of Gorillaz was kind of written as an autobiography from the virtual fictitious characters. So you got Murdoch Nichols, Noodle, 2D, and Russell Hobbs basically writing in their own voices about their respective backstories. Very interesting stuff. By the way, by the time they were doing the Plastic Beach tour, their touring band members were like half of the band, The Clash. Like, they basically brought in band members from The Clash. So they really had it going on from a touring band standpoint. But again, just dive into the discography. And I would actually encourage you to get into the band BLUR, because their songs aren't as ubiquitous now as they were in the 90s. A lot of bands kind of get played naturally a lot less as the decades go on, but go revisit the discography of Blur and then pivot from that and get into the Gorillaz. And it's kind of hard to imagine how one person could be at the helm of both the band and this fictitious Gorillaz project. Just a remarkable feat. But yeah, let me know your thoughts overall about Gorillaz. Let me know what your favorite Gorillaz album is, and let me know what your favorite few Gorillaz songs are. And if you've already heard the new Cracker Islan, let me know what you think about it. But I can't wait to give it a listen. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love music like I do. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.